Earlier this month, I saw lots and lots of social media posts about Jesus' kingship, along the lines of no matter who's president, Jesus is king. And I'll admit to feeling somewhat conflicted when I saw these posts. On the one hand, it's great to see so many people affirming that Jesus is king, making this political statement that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden nor Wall Street or the Second Amendment or anything else on earth is our king. On the other hand, saying that Jesus is king no matter who's president suggests to some that Jesus doesn't really care who is president, which is to imply that Jesus and his followers are indifferent to those who suffer real life consequences like unemployment, deportation, or death due to the outcome of an election. So, on this last Sunday of the church year, when we celebrate Christ the King, it's worth considering what exactly we mean when we proclaim that Jesus is our King. Now, in the classical definition, the king is the final authority to whom those beneath him are subject. With the possible exception of a god, the king acknowledges no power greater than his own and believes that he can give life, food and shelter, livelihood, comfort, wealth, and justice to his subjects, or that he can take those things away. And because we believe that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine, to say that he is king is to grant him supreme authority over us, that we ultimately depend on him and no earthly power for life, basic necessities, and justice. Now, for many Christians, Jesus is king is a statement about the future. They imagine something like this morning's reading from Matthew when the Son of Man comes in his glory and sits on the throne surrounded by angels. In that second coming, Christ's authority will be undeniably greater than every worldly power, and all the people on earth will be subject to his rule. And at that point, King Jesus will judge everyone's deeds and welcome his loyal followers into his kingdom while casting the wicked into hell. Prior to then, however, the individual's duty to Christ the King is much more limited. They tend to think of it as following a moral code for personal behavior, but otherwise obeying the worldly authorities. But this understanding misses half of the point. Jesus is king is also a statement about the present, that Jesus rules us now, even as he will judge us in the future. And furthermore, Jesus rules us not just as individuals making our own choices about sex, drugs, and language, but as communities and nations making choices that affect people other than ourselves. And this reading from Matthew tells us not just about the future judgment, but about how our actions in the present serve as the basis of that judgment. Although they aren't framed as a list of commands, King Jesus is pretty clearly telling his subjects to do six things: feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, care for the sick, and visit the prisoner. And given that Matthew repeats them four times, I've often wondered why we Christians don't treat these six things like we do the Ten Commandments, posting them inside or outside of our buildings and memorizing them as children. Because, like the Ten Commandments, they are simple commands that guide us to live according to our King's word. To name Jesus as King is to commit ourselves to these actions, not just as individuals, but as a community of believers. And fortunately, these are not difficult or uncommon things, even in a time of pandemic. While we may not be able to put food or clothing directly in the hands of the hungry and poor right now, we can still donate goods and money for them. While we may not be able to visit the sick and homebound in person, we can still call and write. And because we as Americans tend to bristle at the idea of anyone ordering us to do anything, it's also worth noting that these six commands are examples of how to live into the great commandments identified by our King. All six are specific ways that we might love our neighbors as ourselves. And Jesus tells us that what we do or don't do for the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner, we are doing or not doing to Jesus, and therefore to the God who we are commanded to love with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Arguably, Christians don't post or memorize these six things because in doing so, we might start to treat them as an exhaustive list of what we are to do and lose sight of other ways that we might similarly love God by loving the least of these among our neighbors. Today, for example, Jesus might additionally commend the sheep who saw me unemployed and gave me work for fair wages, or saw me systematically oppressed and stood with me as a friend, or saw me undocumented and helped me anyway, or saw me abused and believed my story. Which brings me back to the statement that no matter who's president, Jesus is king. Because it's true that no matter who walks the halls of power, we who bow before King Jesus are still obliged to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, care for the sick, visit the prisoner, and otherwise love our neighbors. But we cannot do those things only as individuals. If we are to serve our King by building his kingdom, then we must also obey those commands as a wider community. If we truly believe that Jesus is King, then we should vote for and otherwise support elected officials who use their power to see that the hungry are fed, the strangers welcomed, the sick and imprisoned cared for. Or better yet, we should support officials who strive to end hunger, debt, and other societal pressures that reduce our neighbors to being the least of these. Because no matter who's president, Jesus is king. But sometimes elections feature a candidate who will clearly build Jesus' kingdom, or one whose neglect of the least of these goes directly against King Jesus' commands of love. And so on this Christ the King Sunday, let us remember that if Jesus truly is our King, then our community life and not just our personal behavior falls under his authority. And every decision we make, particularly those choices that affect folks around us, should follow his command to love. And if we need further encouragement, let's remember that unlike presidents and other worldly leaders who we see only through the distance of our screens, it's easy for us to see our King because King Jesus is visible in the faces of the least of these around us: the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, the prisoner, and also the unemployed, the oppressed, the undocumented, and the abused. We love, provide for, and care for such folks not only because our King commands it, but because in doing so, we meet our King, who reigns over us now and later, no matter who holds worldly power.